He was not supposed to matter. In the high valley, where Cusco lay cradled between mountain peaks, a boy was born around 1400 AD to the ruling family of a kingdom that barely extended beyond the horizon. They named him Kuzi Yupanqui, the fortunate one who recounts. A pleasant name for a younger son, a prince who would support his brothers, perform his rituals, and never be burdened with rule. His father, Viracocha Inca, had already designated an heir. The future belonged to someone else. The Inca kingdom that Kusi Yupanqui entered was not yet an empire. It was one polity among many in the fractured world of the high Andes, a patchwork of rival chiefdoms and confederacies competing for the same valleys, the same water, the same terraced fields that made survival possible at 12,000 feet. The Inca controlled Cusco and its immediate surroundings, perhaps a few thousand square miles of mountain terrain. Beyond that, other peoples held other valleys, and no one commanded them all. The Andes themselves shaped everything. Peaks rising to 20,000 feet created vertical worlds where climate changed with every 1,000 feet of elevation. Potatoes grew at heights where maize could not survive. Llamas grazed on grasslands too cold for farming. The peoples who lived here had learned, over millennia, to exploit these vertical zones, trading between elevations, building terraces that turned steep slopes into farmland, engineering channels that carried water from glaciers to fields that would otherwise be desert. Cusco sat at the heart of a sacred landscape. The valley had been home to the Inca for generations, their origin myths placing their emergence at Lake Titicaca to the south, from which the first Inca ancestors had traveled to found their capital in the fertile basin between the rivers. By the time of Kusi Yupanqui's birth, the Inca had ruled Cusco for perhaps 2 centuries, a dynasty that claimed descent from Inti, the sun god himself. The Sapa Inca, the unique Inca, the supreme ruler, was not merely a king, but a divine being, the son of the sun made flesh, the intermediary between the human world and the cosmic forces that governed existence. But divine ancestry did not guarantee divine power. Viracocha Inca ruled a kingdom surrounded by rivals who respected Inca, claims only as far as Inca spears could enforce them. To the north, the Chanca Confederacy had been expanding for decades, absorbing smaller groups, building a military reputation that made neighboring peoples tremble. To the south, around Lake Titicaca, the Colla and Lupaca kingdoms controlled populations and resources that dwarfed what Cusco commanded. The Inca were one voice in a chorus, and not the loudest. The young prince received the education appropriate to his station. He learned the oral histories that connected the present to the mythic past, the stories of Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, the first Inca who had emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca, bearing a golden staff that would sink into the earth at the place destined for their capital. He learned the movements of the sun and stars, the astronomical knowledge that governed planting and harvest, that determined when ceremonies must be performed to maintain the balance between human society and cosmic order. He learned the rituals that sustained the relationship between the living and the dead, between the visible world and the forces that animated it. He also learned the practical arts of rule. He observed the systems that organized Inca society, the Elu kinship groups that formed the basic unit of social organization, the reciprocal obligations that bound rulers and ruled in networks of mutual responsibility. He watched how water was managed, how terraces were maintained, how storehouses were filled against the famines that could strike without warning in a land where frost could destroy crops overnight. He absorbed the understanding that survival in the Andes required organization, cooperation, and the constant labor of maintaining the infrastructure that made civilization possible at impossible altitudes. His older brother, Inca Urco, was everything Yupanqui was not. Where the younger prince was quiet and observant, Urko was confident to the point of arrogance. Where Yupanqui watched and listened, Urko acted and expected obedience. Their father Viracocha Inca had chosen Urko as his successor, seeing in the older son the martial bearing that leadership seemed to require. Urko would continue the dynasty. Yupanqui would serve him, as younger sons had always served their elder brothers. The relationship between the quiet prince and his father remained distant. Viracocha Inca focused his attention on the heir, on the son who would carry forward the burden of divine kingship. Yupanqui existed at the margins of royal attention, present at ceremonies but not central to them, educated in statecraft but not expected to practice it. The arrangement suited the conventions of succession. It did not suit whatever ambitions stirred behind the young prince's watchful eyes. What he saw when he watched troubled him. The Chanca Confederacy was growing stronger with each passing year. Their warriors had conquered peoples closer and closer to Cusco, their reputation spreading fear before their armies arrived. The Inca responded with diplomacy when possible, with defensive measures when necessary, but always with the understanding that a confrontation was coming. The Chanca did not seek coexistence. They sought dominance, and the fertile valley of Cusco lay directly in their path. Viracocha Inca's strategy relied on caution, maintain defenses, avoid provocations, hope that the Chanca would exhaust themselves against other enemies before turning their full attention to Cusco. It was a reasonable approach for a kingdom that could not match its rival in military strength. It was also, Yupanqui began to suspect, a strategy that would end in submission or destruction. The prince said nothing. Younger sons did not question their father's wisdom, did not challenge the decisions of divine kings, did not suggest that caution might be another name for weakness. He performed his duties, observed the court, and waited for events to reveal what words could not express. By the late 1430s, waiting was no longer possible. The Chanca had defeated their other rivals and consolidated their confederacy into a military force that no single Andean polity could resist. Their leaders, Uscavilca and Ancavilca, turned their attention south toward the prize they had always intended to claim. Cusco, sacred valley, seat of the sun-descended dynasty, heart of Inca identity, lay before them like fruit waiting to be plucked. The messengers who reached Cusco brought news that emptied faces of color. The Chanca were coming. Not raiders seeking plunder, not skirmishers testing defenses, but the full force of the Confederacy marching to end Inca independence forever. They would arrive within days, and they were coming to conquer. Viracocha Inca heard the reports and made his decision. He would not fight. The Chanca were too strong, the odds too unfavorable, the risk of total destruction too great. Better to withdraw, to preserve the dynasty in exile, to hope that some future opportunity might allow a return. He ordered preparations for retreat to Calca, a secondary site in the Sacred Valley, where the royal family might survive what Cusco could not. Inca Urco, the designated heir, supported his father's decision. The court prepared to flee. Yupanqui, the younger son who was not supposed to matter, looked at the city he had grown up in. The temples, the plazas, the sacred stones that connected his people to their gods, and refused to leave. What happened next would transform him from a forgotten prince into the founder of the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. He would no longer be Yupanqui, the fortunate one who recounts. He would become Pachacuti, the one who shakes the earth, who overturns space and time, who remakes the world itself. The royal family fled at dawn, and the younger prince stayed behind. Viracocha Inca led his court northward to Calca, abandoning Cusco to whatever fate the Chanca would impose. Inca Urco rode beside his father, the designated heir preserving himself for a future that might never come. The decision followed a certain logic. Dynasties had survived in exile before, had returned when circumstances changed, had outlasted conquerors who seemed invincible in their moment of triumph. What mattered was continuity, the preservation of the sacred bloodline, not the defense of stones that could be rebuilt. Yupanqui saw it differently. Cusco was not merely a city, it was the navel of the world, the point where the human realm connected to the divine, the place where his ancestors had sunk the golden staff that marked their destiny. To abandon it without a fight was to abandon everything that made the Inca who they were. Better to die defending sacred ground than to live as refugees, begging for the return of a home that cowardice had surrendered. He began gathering those who would stand with him. The sources that describe what followed were recorded a century later by Spanish chroniclers collecting oral histories from Inca descendants, and they carry the weight of legend. But legends often preserve truths that mere facts cannot capture, and the truth of what happened outside Cusco in 1438 was this: a younger son, whom no one expected to lead, became the rallying point for a defense that no one expected to succeed. Warriors who had not followed Viracocha into exile answered the prince's call. Common soldiers, minor nobles, men who could not stomach the thought of surrender. They gathered around Yupanqui because he was the only member of the royal family still willing to fight. Allies from neighboring peoples joined them, the Kanas and the Kanchis, groups who had their own reasons to fear Chanca dominance, and saw in the desperate defense of Cusco a chance to stop the tide that would otherwise sweep over them as well. The prince positioned his forces to use the terrain that had shaped Andean warfare for millennia. Cusco sat in a valley, but the approaches to it climbed through passes and defiles where numbers mattered less than determination. The Chanca would have to come uphill, their lungs burning in the thin air, their formations stretched along paths that favored defenders. Every stone wall, every natural choke point, every advantage the mountains offered, Yupanqui intended to use them all. The Chanca came confident of victory. They had broken every enemy they faced. Their warriors carried the momentum of conquest, the psychological weight of a reputation that made opponents surrender before battle was joined. Uscovilca and Ancovilca led an army that expected to sweep through Cusco's defenses, plunder its temples, and absorb its people into their confederacy. This was not a war between equals. This was the final step in Chanca supremacy over the Central Highlands. What they found instead was resistance that would not break. The fighting lasted days, wave after wave of Chanca assault, crashing against defenders who held their ground with a ferocity born of desperation. The prince was everywhere, directing reinforcements to threatened points, rallying men who wavered, demonstrating through his presence that the royal blood had not abandoned them. He fought personally, leading counterattacks that drove the Chanca back from positions they had nearly taken, showing the courage that his father and brother had failed to display. Legend says that the stones themselves rose to fight for Cusco. The Pururaucas, stones transformed into warriors by divine intervention, joined the battle at its most desperate moment, turning what seemed like certain defeat into impossible victory. Whether this was literal miracle, metaphor for reinforcements arriving when hope had faded, or simply the way oral tradition explained an inexplicable triumph, the meaning was clear. The gods had chosen sides, and they had chosen the prince who stayed when others fled. The Chanca broke. Their army, which had never known defeat, shattered against the walls of Cusco and fled northward in disorder. Yupanqui pursued them, refusing to let the victory remain merely defensive. He chased the Chanca through the highlands, destroying their forces in a series of engagements that transformed a successful defense into the annihilation of a rival power. Uscovilca was killed. His mummified body would later become a trophy, displayed to remind future generations of what the Inca had overcome. The Chanca Confederacy collapsed, its component peoples absorbed into the rising power that had defeated them. The prince returned to Cusco as something new. He was no longer Yupanqui, the younger son, the fortunate one who recounts. The victory had revealed him as something unprecedented, a ruler chosen not by hereditary succession, but by divine favor demonstrated in battle. The priests and nobles who had witnessed his triumph gave him a new name, Pachacuti, a word that meant cataclysm, transformation, the overturning of the world. It was a name for someone who had changed the fundamental order of things, who had made possible what had seemed impossible, who had remade reality itself through force of will. Viracocha Inca returned from his exile to find his kingdom transformed and his authority hollow. The army that had saved Cusco owed its loyalty to the son who had led them, not the father who had fled. The nobles who had stayed recognized Pachacuti's claim through the oldest of all legitimacies, victory. The priests who interpreted divine will could see clearly whose side the gods had taken. Viracocha Inca lived out his remaining years in comfortable irrelevance. His status as former Sapa, Inca acknowledged, but his power non-existent. Inca Urco's fate was harsher. The designated heir who had fled with his father could not accept his displacement gracefully. Some sources say he attempted to resist, to assert the succession rights that birth had given him. If so, the resistance was brief and futile. Urco died, killed in the confusion of the transition, executed for defiance, or simply eliminated as a threat to the new order. The chronicles are unclear on details, but they are unanimous on the outcome. Urco vanished from history, a footnote to his younger brother's triumph. Pachacuti assumed the throne of a kingdom that had nearly ceased to exist, and he immediately began transforming it into something that had never existed before. The victory over the Chanca had demonstrated possibilities that cautious rulers like Viracocha Inca had never imagined. The confederacy that had threatened to swallow Cusco was gone, its peoples now subject to Inca authority. The neighboring groups who had joined the defense, the Canas, the Canchis, others who had gambled on the young prince, were now bound to the Inca by ties of shared battle and mutual interest. The fear that had constrained Inca ambitions for generations had been replaced by a confidence born of survival against impossible odds. But Pachacuti understood that confidence alone could not build what he now envisioned. The kingdom he had inherited was too small, too fragile, too dependent on the qualities of individual rulers to sustain itself against future threats. Another Chanca would arise, or some other power would grow strong, while the Inca remained static. Survival required more than defending what existed. It required expansion, transformation, the creation of a state so powerful that no rival could threaten it. The man who had saved Cusco from destruction would now rebuild it entirely. The warrior who had defeated the Chanca would become an administrator, an architect, an engineer of empire. The younger son, who was never supposed to rule, would reshape the Andes themselves. He had shaken the earth once. He was about to shake it again. Pachacuti looked at Cusco and saw not what it was, but what it could become. The city that had nearly fallen to the Chanca was a collection of stone buildings clustered around sacred spaces, adequate for a small kingdom, insufficient for the empire he intended to build. If Cusco was to be the center of the world, it needed to look like the center of the world. He ordered the city demolished and rebuilt from its foundations. The new Cusco would be shaped like a puma. The great cat, sacred to Andean peoples, would stretch across the valley floor, its head formed by the fortress of Sacsayhuaman on the hill above the city, its body comprising the temples and palaces and plazas that housed the empire's heart. The two rivers that flowed through Cusco were channeled into stone-lined courses, straightened and controlled, transformed from natural features into elements of sacred geometry. Streets followed the puma's form. Districts corresponded to parts of its body. The entire urban plan became a living symbol of power and divine purpose. At the city's heart, Pachacuti reconstructed the Coricancha, the temple of the sun. The original temple had been modest, appropriate for a minor kingdom. The new Coricancha would announce Inca supremacy to anyone who entered it. Walls covered in sheets of gold reflected the light of Inti, the sun god from whom the Sapa Inca claimed descent. A garden filled with golden replicas of plants, animals, and people demonstrated wealth that defied comprehension. The mummies of previous rulers sat in niches, attended by servants, consulted on important decisions, their continuing presence demonstrating that death did not end an Inca emperor's role in governing his people. But Pachacuti understood that symbols alone could not hold an empire together. He created systems of administration that would allow centralized control over territories stretching thousands of miles. The decimal system organized the population into units of 10, 50, 100, 500, 1,000, 5,000, and 10,000 households, each level supervised by officials who reported to the level above. A man responsible for 10 families answered to a man responsible for 50. That man answered to one responsible for 100. And so, the chain continued upward until it reached the Sapa Inca himself. Every person in the empire had a place in the hierarchy, a supervisor who tracked their obligations, a role in the system that bound them all together. The Maita made the system function. This labor tribute required every household to contribute work to the state, not money or goods, which the Inca economy did not use in the way European economies did, but time and effort. Mitar laborers built the roads that connected the empire. They constructed the storehouses that held reserves against famine. They terraced mountainsides, dug irrigation channels, wove cloth, and served in the armies that expanded Inca territory. In return, the state provided for them during their service and guaranteed access to land and resources when they returned home. It was reciprocity on a massive scale. The mutual obligations of the Ailu kinship system extended to encompass an entire civilization. Record-keeping made administration possible, and the Inca kept records without writing. The quipu, knotted strings hanging from a central cord, encoded information in ways that Spanish conquistadors never fully understood, and modern scholars are still deciphering. Knot positions indicated numbers. String colors may have indicated categories. The arrangement of strings on the cord conveyed relationships between data points. Quipu masters memorized the meanings their knots represented, maintaining archives that tracked population counts, tribute obligations, storehouse inventories, and perhaps historical narratives as well. An empire without writing had found its own way to remember. With these systems taking shape, Pachacuti turned to expansion. The Chanca defeat had demonstrated that the Inca could overcome enemies who seemed invincible. The administrative machinery Pachacuti was building could incorporate conquered peoples into a functioning state. What remained was to actually conquer them, to transform a kingdom that had nearly been destroyed into an empire that dominated the Andes. He moved south first, toward the wealthy kingdoms around Lake Titicaca. The Colla and Lupaca had controlled the Altiplano for generations, their herds of llamas and alpacas providing wealth that made them powers in their own right. Pachacuti led armies through the high plateau, the cold air and vast distances testing Inca logistics to their limits. Some groups submitted without fighting, recognizing that resistance meant destruction, while submission meant incorporation into a system that might preserve their local autonomy. Others resisted and learned the cost of defiance. The conquests followed a pattern that Pachacuti refined through experience. Diplomacy came first. Inca ambassadors offered alliance, emphasizing the benefits of joining the growing empire, protection against other enemies, access to goods from distant ecological zones, the prestige of association with the sons of the sun. Local rulers who accepted these terms kept their positions, becoming Inca administrators rather than independent chiefs. Their children were brought to Cusco for education, ensuring both hostages for good behavior and a new generation raised in Inca ways. Those who refused diplomacy faced military consequences. The Inca army that Pachacuti fielded was unlike anything the Andes had seen. Organized into decimal units, supplied from storehouses positioned along the routes of advance, commanded by officers whose promotions depended on demonstrated ability rather than birth alone. It was a professional force in an age of warrior bands. His brother, Capac Yupanqui, emerged as the most capable of his generals, leading campaigns that extended Inca authority ever further, while Pachacuti remained in Cusco, directing the broader strategy. Conquered peoples were not simply exploited. They were integrated. Local gods were brought to Cusco and installed in temples, subordinate to Inti but still honored. Their worshippers could see their deities respected, even as they acknowledged Inca supremacy. Local elites received positions in the imperial administration. Their authority now derived from the Sapa Inca rather than from independent tradition. The Quechua language spread as the empire's lingua franca, a common tongue that allowed communication across regions where dozens of languages had previously fragmented understanding. By 1450, the Inca controlled territory that dwarfed anything their ancestors had imagined. The kingdom that had barely extended beyond Cusco's valley now stretched from the edges of the Amazon rainforest to the shores of Lake Titicaca, from the coastal deserts to the high Puna grasslands. Populations that had lived independently for millennia now sent tribute to Cusco, sent their sons to serve in Inca armies, sent their daughters to weave in Inca workshops. The Four Quarters, Tawantinsuyu, was taking shape, a concept of universal rule that placed Cusco at the center of everything that mattered. Pachacuti had built the machinery of empire. Now he would give it a form that would endure for centuries. The warrior was becoming an architect. The conqueror was becoming a builder. The man who had saved Cusco from destruction would transform the Andes themselves into a monument to Inca power. Stone by stone, terrace by terrace, road by road, he was just beginning. The stones fit so precisely that a knife blade could not slip between them. Pachacuti's builders worked without mortar, without iron tools, without wheeled vehicles to transport the massive blocks they shaped. They used bronze chisels, stone hammers, and patience measured in generations. Each block was carved to fit its neighbors exactly, ground and polished until the surfaces mated so perfectly that the joints seemed to disappear. When earthquakes struck, and earthquakes always struck in the Andes, the stones danced in their settings and settled back into place, flexing rather than shattering, surviving tremors that would have collapsed European cathedrals. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman rose above Cusco like a crown of stone. 3 massive walls zigzagged across the hillside, each terrace set back from the one below, creating a defensive complex that could withstand any assault the pre-gunpowder world might throw against it. The largest stones weighed over 100 tons, blocks the size of houses, somehow transported from quarries miles away, somehow raised into position, somehow fitted together with tolerances that modern engineers struggle to explain. 20,000 workers labored on Sacsayhuaman during Pachacuti's reign, a project so vast that it would not be completed until his grandson's time. The fortress protected more than the city. It protected the idea of Inca invincibility, the visible proof that the sons of the sun could accomplish what no other people could imagine. Visitors from conquered territories looked up at those walls and understood that resistance was futile, that the power which could move mountains of stone could certainly crush any rebellion. Below the fortress, Cusco itself became a monument. The Coricancha's golden garden surpassed anything the Andes had ever seen. Life-size replicas of maize plants, complete with leaves and ears, stood in rows as if growing from the temple floor. But these plants were hammered gold, their surfaces catching sunlight that transformed the space into something unearthly. Golden llamas grazed among golden shepherds. Golden butterflies rested on golden flowers. The entire garden was a frozen moment of abundance, wealth made visible, the riches of the empire concentrated in one overwhelming display. But Pachacuti's vision extended far beyond Cusco. Across the sacred valley, he built royal estates that demonstrated Inca mastery of landscape itself. Ollantaytambo rose at a strategic point where the valley narrowed, its terraces climbing the mountainside in steps so regular they seemed carved from a single block. Paisac perched above another valley, its agricultural terraces curving to follow the contours of the land, its temples aligned to capture the solstices, its urban sectors arranged to house the administrators who managed surrounding territories. And then there was Machu Picchu. The estate that would become Pachacuti's most famous legacy was built on a ridge between 2 peaks, invisible from the valley below, accessible only through paths that could be defended by a handful of men against an army. It was not a city in the ordinary sense. Perhaps only 750 people lived there at its height, but a royal retreat, a sanctuary where the Sapa Inca could escape the ceremonies of Cusco, a private world of terraces and temples suspended between earth and sky. The Intihuatana stone anchored Machu Picchu to the cosmos. This carved rock pillar, its name meaning hitching post of the sun, was precisely positioned to cast specific shadows at the solstices, allowing priests to track the sun's movement and ensure that the cosmic order remained stable. Similar stones had existed at Inca sites throughout the empire, but the Spanish would systematically destroy them as instruments of pagan worship. Machu Picchu's Intihuatana survived only because the Spanish never found the site. The Temple of the Sun curved to follow the natural granite outcrop on which it was built, its windows aligned to frame the sunrise on the winter solstice. The room of 3 windows opened onto the central plaza, its trapezoidal openings, the signature shape of Inca architecture, perfectly framing views of the surrounding peaks. Every element of Machu Picchu connected the human construction to the natural landscape, the built environment flowing from and into the mountains that surrounded it. Water engineering made these achievements possible. The Inca understood hydrology with a sophistication that still impresses engineers. Channels carved into mountainsides carried water from glacial sources to agricultural terraces miles away. Fountains in Machu Picchu were fed by springs that Pachacuti's engineers had identified and tapped, the water flowing through stone channels with gradients calculated to prevent erosion while maintaining pressure. Drainage systems beneath plazas and buildings prevented the accumulation of moisture that would have undermined foundations in a climate where afternoon rains fell almost daily during the wet season. The terraces themselves were technological marvels. What appeared to be simple stepped platforms were actually complex systems designed to create microclimates at different elevations. Each terrace level maintained slightly different temperature and moisture conditions, allowing experimentation with crops adapted to various zones. Drainage layers of gravel beneath the topsoil prevented waterlogging, while retaining enough moisture for cultivation. The walls that retained each terrace were built with the same precision as temple walls, their stones fitted to survive centuries of seismic activity. The labor that built these wonders came from across the empire. The Mitmakuna relocated populations provided workers for projects that no single community could complete. Families moved from their home territories to wherever the state needed them, bringing skills specific to their regions. Stoneworkers from areas with quarrying traditions, metal workers from the coast, weavers from communities known for textile production. The relocations served multiple purposes. They distributed labor where it was needed. They broke up populations that might resist Inca authority, and they mixed peoples so thoroughly that ethnic identities faded into a common Inca identity. Pachacuti organized the sacred landscape as carefully as he organized the state. The Seke system radiated from the Coricancha like spokes from a wheel, 41 lines stretching to the horizon, each marked by huacas, sacred sites that might be springs, rock outcrops, peaks, or places where important events had occurred. The Sikh organized ritual responsibility. Different Elu groups maintained different shrines along different lines, their duties rotating through a calendar that connected celestial movements to earthly obligations. The entire landscape became a text that the initiated could read, a three-dimensional map of Inca cosmology inscribed on the mountains themselves. By 1460, Pachacuti had transformed the physical world. The empire that had been a collection of conquered territories was now held together by roads that crossed every terrain, by storehouses that guaranteed survival through any crisis, by administrative centers that replicated Cusco's order throughout the provinces. The mountains themselves bore Inca marks, terraces reshaping slopes, channels redirecting water, buildings rising from stone that had lain unchanged for millennia. He had built in stone because stone endured. He had built with precision because precision reflected cosmic order. He had built on a scale that defied comprehension because scale demonstrated power that could not be challenged. The empire was no longer held together by force alone. It was held together by the visible evidence of what the Inca could accomplish. Engineering that seemed magical, organization that seemed divine, achievement that seemed beyond human capacity. Pachacuti had made the impossible routine. Now he would govern the world he had created. The empire stretched further than any person could walk in a year. From the coastal deserts where rain never fell to the cloud forests where it never stopped, from the frozen heights of the Altiplano to the jungle's edge where the mountains dissolved into green infinity. Tawantinsuyu encompassed more ecological diversity than most continents. The peoples who lived within its boundaries spoke dozens of languages, worshipped hundreds of gods, maintained traditions that stretched back millennia before the Inca existed. Governing them required more than conquest. It required systems that could function across distances that made direct supervision impossible. The Chapak Nyan, the royal road, made the empire possible. Over 25,000 miles of roads connected Cusco to the furthest provinces, two main arteries running the length of the realm with countless branches reaching into every valley and district. In the highlands, the roads climbed through passes over 15,000 feet, their surfaces paved with flat stones, their edges marked by low walls that guided travelers through snow and fog. On the coast, they ran straight across deserts where nothing grew, their paths visible for miles in landscapes where landmarks barely existed. Where rivers blocked the way, suspension bridges woven from plant fibers spanned gorges that seemed impossible to cross. Swaying walkways that terrified Spanish conquistadors who had never seen anything like them. The roads carried more than travelers. They carried the empire itself. Chasqui runners manned relay stations positioned every few miles along the major routes. These messengers, selected for speed and endurance, waited in small shelters for the arrival of information that needed to travel faster than any person could walk. A Chasqui would receive a message, encoded in quipu knots or memorized as spoken words, and sprint to the next station where another runner waited to continue the chain. Working in relays, running day and night, the Chasqui could move information 150 miles in a single day, delivering news from the furthest provinces to Cusco faster than horse-mounted couriers could have managed. Fresh fish from the Pacific arrived in Cusco still edible, carried by Chasqui across 200 miles of mountain terrain in less than 2 days. When rebellion flared in distant territories, the Sapa Inca knew within days rather than weeks. Orders traveled outward with the same speed, allowing coordinated responses to crises that might have fragmented a less connected realm. The roads and runners transformed geography from an obstacle into an instrument of control. Tambos, way stations, lined the routes at intervals of a day's travel. These standardized facilities provided shelter for officials and soldiers, storage for supplies, and lodging for the Chasqui, who kept communications flowing. A traveler on state business could walk the entire length of the empire without ever needing to carry food or find independent shelter. The tambos also served as administrative nodes, their managers tracking movements, monitoring local conditions, ensuring that the system functioned without interruption. The kulkas made the system sustainable. Thousands of storehouses dotted the landscape, positioned along roads, near population centers, and in strategic locations throughout the provinces. They held everything the empire might need: dried meat and freeze-dried potatoes that could last for years, cloth and sandals for armies on campaign, weapons and tools for construction projects, seed corn for planting after failed harvests. When drought struck a province, supplies flowed from storehouses where surpluses had accumulated. When armies marched to war, they drew from depots positioned along their routes, rather than plundering the territories they crossed. The abundance represented in those storehouses was itself a form of power. Populations that might have starved under independent rulers instead survived through Inca distribution. The Mita labor that filled the kulkas was repaid when crisis struck, and the state provided what families could not provide for themselves. Reciprocity operated at imperial scale. The same mutual obligations that bound families and Ellis now bound the Sapa Inca to millions of subjects he would never meet. The Awanayela, the chosen women, served the empire in ways that bound communities to Cusco. Selected from across the territories for beauty, skill, or noble birth, these women were brought to special compounds where they wove the finest textiles, brewed the sacred chicha beer for ceremonies, and served the cult of Inti. Some became secondary wives of the Sapa Inca himself. Others were given to nobles and military commanders as rewards for service, creating marriage alliances that tied the empire's elite together. The families who surrendered daughters to the ACL system gained prestige and connection to the imperial center. The system extracted the most talented women from local communities and converted them into instruments of state unity. Local lords, the Curajas, administered their peoples under Inca supervision. Conquest did not necessarily remove traditional leaders from power. Those who had submitted peacefully often retained their positions, their authority now flowing from the Sapa Inca rather than from independent tradition. Their sons were educated in Cusco, learning Inca ways while serving as hostages for their father's good behavior. The cuirassas collected tribute, organized mita labor, and maintained order in their territories. But they did so as agents of the empire, answerable to Inca inspectors who could remove them for failure or disloyalty. The gods themselves were reorganized to reflect Inca supremacy. Conquered peoples did not have to abandon their traditional deities. Instead, those gods were incorporated into a hierarchy that placed Inti, the sun god and divine ancestor of the Sapa Inca, at the apex. Local gods became subordinate powers in a cosmic order that mirrored the political order of the empire. Priests from provincial cults learned to perform their rituals within frameworks that acknowledged Inca supremacy. The sacred and the political intertwined so thoroughly that religious observance became a form of imperial loyalty. Pachacuti himself embodied the system's center. His days followed rhythms of ritual and governance that demonstrated his role as intermediary between human and divine realms. He rose before dawn to greet the sun, performing ceremonies that maintained the cosmic balance on which all life depended. He received reports from across the empire, consulting with officials who managed the decimal administration, hearing petitions from cuirassas seeking favor or resolution of disputes. He performed the sacrifices that ensured good harvests, led the festivals that marked the agricultural calendar, presided over the ceremonies that transformed boys into warriors, and designated which women would join the ACLA. His wife, Mama Anahuaque, managed the female side of the royal household, a domain as complex as the empire itself, with its own hierarchies, its own obligations, its own political significance. The royal couple's relationship demonstrated the complementary duality that Andean thought saw running through the cosmos. Male and female, upper and lower, right and left, each necessary for the other's completion. By 1470, Pachacuti had ruled for over 3 decades. He had transformed a kingdom that nearly perished into an empire that dominated the known world. He had built cities and fortresses that would outlast the civilization that created them. He had established systems of administration, communication, and storage that allowed centralized control over territories larger than most European nations combined. He had reorganized religion, reshaped society, and rewritten history to place the Inca at the center of everything. But he was growing old. The man who had rallied the defense of Cusco as a young prince, who had led armies across the highlands, who had personally supervised the construction of monuments. That man now felt the weight of years that even divine ancestry could not hold back. The empire he had created needed to survive beyond his lifetime. The systems he had built needed to function without his personal direction. He began to think about what would outlast him, about who would carry forward what he had begun. The Earthshaker was preparing to hand the world to the next generation. Succession in the Inca world was never simple, and Pachacuti knew better than anyone what happened when it went wrong. He had taken power by proving himself when the designated heir had fled. He had eliminated his brother Urco because divided succession meant civil war. He understood that the empire he had built could fracture overnight if the transition to the next ruler was contested, if factions formed around rival claimants, if the violence that had accompanied his own rise repeated itself. He chose his son, Topa Inca Yupanqui, as heir, not because Topa was the eldest, but because Topa had demonstrated the qualities that ruling Tawantinsuyu would require. The young prince had already proven himself in military campaigns that extended the empire beyond anything Pachacuti had achieved alone. While his father consolidated control over the highlands, Topa Inca had led armies northward into what is now Ecuador, conquering the kingdom of Quito and pushing Inca authority to the edges of Colombia. He had inherited his father's strategic intelligence, his capacity for organization, his understanding that conquest without administration was merely raiding. But the greatest test still lay ahead: the Chimu Empire. On the northern coast of Peru, the Chimu had built the only civilization that could rival the Inca in sophistication. Their capital at Chan Chan sprawled across the desert, a city of adobe palaces and irrigated gardens that housed perhaps 30,000 people. Their craftsmen produced goldwork and textiles that even the Inca admired. Their irrigation systems transformed coastal desert into agricultural land that supported populations the highlands could not match. For generations, the Chimu had dominated the coast, while the Inca dominated the mountains. Two empires growing toward an inevitable collision. Pachacuti planned the campaign, Topa Inca executed it. The conquest of Chimor demonstrated everything the Inca military system could accomplish. Armies descended from the highlands to cut the irrigation canals on which coastal agriculture depended. Without water, the desert reclaimed the fields within weeks. The Chimu faced a choice between surrender and starvation. Their king submitted, and the empire that had seemed impregnable became another province of Tawantinsuyu. The Inca absorbed Chimu techniques as they had absorbed conquered peoples. Metal workers from the coast were brought to Cusco, their skills enhancing Inca gold work. Administrative methods that the Chimu had developed for governing their territories were incorporated into Inca practice. The conquest was not merely military. It was the absorption of a rival civilization's achievements into the expanding Inca synthesis. With Topa Inca demonstrating his capacity to rule, Pachacuti began withdrawing from active governance. The transition was gradual, a careful handover rather than an abrupt abdication. Pachacuti continued to participate in major ceremonies, his presence lending legitimacy to decisions that Topa Inca increasingly made. He offered counsel when asked, drawing on decades of experience that no one else possessed. But day by day, the administrative burden shifted to younger shoulders, and the empire learned to function under new leadership while the old leader still lived. Pachacuti used his final years to shape how the empire would remember itself. He summoned the keepers of oral tradition, the men who memorized the histories, the genealogies, the accounts of how the world had come to be, and he reorganized what they preserved. The origin myths were standardized, their variations reconciled into official versions that placed the Inca at the center of cosmic history. The deeds of previous rulers were edited to emphasize the themes that Pachacuti wanted emphasized: the divine mandate of Inca rule, the inevitability of Inca expansion, the benevolence of Inca governance for the peoples brought under its protection. History became policy. The past was reshaped to serve the present and to constrain the future. He formalized the Panica system that would preserve royal memory across generations. Each Sapa Inca, upon death, would leave behind a corporation of descendants, his Panica, responsible for maintaining his mummy, his properties, his cult. The Panica would keep the dead ruler's memory alive, bringing his preserved body out for festivals, consulting him on important decisions, maintaining his estates as if he still lived. This meant that royal properties did not pass to the next ruler. Each new Sapa Inca had to acquire his own wealth, his own lands, his own resources. The system created powerful incentives for expansion. Each ruler needed conquest to establish himself, while ensuring that previous rulers were never truly gone. Pachacuti's own Panica would maintain his legacy for generations, their fortunes tied to his continued veneration, their status dependent on the honors paid to his memory. He was building his own immortality, constructing the social machinery that would keep him present in Inca life long after his body ceased to move on its own. The cult of Inti received its definitive form during these years. Pachacuti had always emphasized the sun god's centrality, the Sapa Inca as Inti's sun, the Coricancha as the empire's sacred heart, the solar calendar governing the rhythms of state and society. Now he systematized what had been developing throughout his reign. The priesthood was organized into formal hierarchies. The ceremonies were codified, their timing fixed, their performance standardized across the empire. The relationship between divine and royal power was made explicit. To serve Inti was to serve the Sapa Inca. To defy the Sapa Inca was to defy the cosmic order itself. Religion and politics fused so completely that distinguishing them became impossible. The empire was a theocracy in the most literal sense, ruled by God through his living representative, enforced by systems that presented human authority as divine mandate. Pachacuti in his final years embodied the order he had created. He appeared at ceremonies as the still point around which the empire revolved, his presence sufficient even when his active participation diminished. He received the tribute that flowed from the four quarters, the goods and services that demonstrated continued submission to Inca authority. He blessed the armies that marched under Topa Inca's command, lending his sacred authority to campaigns he no longer led in person. Those who observed him in these years saw a man at peace with what he had accomplished. The desperate prince who had rallied a doomed defense had become the architect of the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. The systems he had built functioned without constant supervision. The heir he had chosen was proving worthy of the inheritance. The monuments he had constructed would outlast generations. The history he had shaped would be remembered as he wished it remembered. He had taken a kingdom on the edge of destruction and transformed it into something that seemed eternal. Whatever came next, and something always came next, would build on foundations he had laid. His name would be spoken as long as the empire endured. His mummy would sit in the Coricancha among the other divine rulers, consulted and honored, never quite dead as long as his Panica maintained his cult. The Earthshaker had finished shaking the earth. Now he prepared to join the ancestors, whose legacy he had so dramatically surpassed. The man who had remade the world was ready to leave it. Pachacuti died around 1471 or 1472. The sources disagree, as they disagree about so much from an era before written records existed in the Andes. What happened next would have seemed strange to European observers, but made perfect sense within the world Pachacuti had built. His body did not decay into forgotten dust. It became something more powerful than it had been in life. The embalmers removed his organs and preserved what remained through techniques that Spanish chroniclers never fully understood. The mummy was dressed in the finest textiles, adorned with gold and feathers, seated in the position of authority he had occupied for over 3 decades. His eyes were replaced with shell and stone that seemed to watch those who approached. His Panica, the corporation of descendants charged with maintaining his cult, took possession of his estates, his servants, his wealth. Pachacuti was dead, but Pachacuti had not departed. The mummy sat in the coricancha among the other royal ancestors, receiving visitors, presiding over ceremonies, consulted on important decisions as if death were merely a change of state rather than an ending. Servants brought food and drink that the living consumed on his behalf. Women who had attended him in life continued attending him in death. On festival days, his mummy was carried through Cusco in procession, the founder of the empire still visible to the people he had created. The living spoke to him and believed he answered. His panica interpreted his will, claiming to know what he would have wanted, wielding influence through their role as intermediaries between the empire and its greatest builder. The system Pachacuti had designed ensured that his death would not diminish his presence. If anything, it amplified his authority by removing the limitations of a mortal body. Topa Inca Yupanqui continued what his father had begun. The empire expanded southward into what is now Chile and Argentina, northward into Ecuador and the edges of Colombia. Armies marched along the roads Pachacuti had built, supplied from the storehouses Pachacuti had filled, organized according to the systems Pachacuti had designed. The decimal administration tracked millions of people across hundreds of thousands of square miles. The Mita extracted labor that built new terraces, new roads, new monuments to Inca power. Everything functioned as Pachacuti had intended. Topa Inca's son, Huayna Capac, brought the empire to its greatest extent, ruling a territory that stretched nearly 3,000 miles from north to south. By the early 16th century, Tawantinsuyu encompassed perhaps 12 million people. Estimates vary, but even the conservative figures describe the largest state the Americas had ever seen. The systems that Pachacuti had created half a century earlier still organized this vast realm, still coordinated its administration, still held together peoples who had nothing in common except Inca rule. Then the world Pachacuti built began to crack. Huayna Capac died around 1528, probably from smallpox that had spread southward from Spanish contact in Central America, the conquistadors' diseases running ahead of the conquistadors themselves. His death triggered exactly the succession crisis that Pachacuti had worked so hard to prevent. Two sons claimed the throne: Huáscar, based in Cusco and supported by traditionalists, and Atahualpa, commanding the armies in the north. Civil war tore through the empire, brother against brother. The administrative systems turned toward mutual destruction rather than common purpose. Atahualpa won. By 1532, he had defeated Huáscar's forces and claimed the throne of a realm exhausted by years of internal warfare. He was consolidating his victory when messengers brought news of strangers approaching. Bearded men riding animals no one had ever seen, carrying weapons that killed with thunder, demanding to meet the ruler of the Inca. Francisco Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 soldiers to conquer an empire of millions. The story of what followed, the ambush at Cajamarca, Atahualpa's capture and execution, the fall of Cusco, the decades of resistance and ultimate Spanish victory, belongs to a different history. What matters here is what happened to Pachacuti's legacy when his world collided with forces he could never have imagined. The Spanish found the royal mummies and were horrified by what they represented. Ancestor worship was idolatry. The preserved bodies of kings were instruments of Satan. The conquistadors and the priests who followed them systematically destroyed what they found. Some mummies were burned. Others were hidden by Inca loyalists and never recovered. Pachacuti's own mummy disappeared during the conquest, perhaps destroyed perhaps concealed in some location that those who hid it took to their graves. But while the Spanish destroyed what they could touch, they also preserved what they could record. Chroniclers like Pedro Cieza de León, Juan de Betanzos, and Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa collected oral histories from Inca survivors, writing down the stories that had been memorized and transmitted for generations. Garcilaso de la Vega, son of a conquistador and an Inca princess, compiled traditions from both sides of his heritage. These sources, written decades after the conquest by men who often did not understand what they were recording, remain our primary evidence for everything we know about Pachacuti and his world. The problems with these sources are immense. The Spanish heard what Inca informants chose to tell them, filtered through translation, shaped by the political circumstances of colonial rule. Different informants told different stories, their accounts contradicting each other on basic facts. The Inca themselves had revised their own histories. Pachacuti had personally supervised the standardization of tradition, so the oral accounts already reflected layers of political editing before the Spanish ever arrived. What we know about Pachacuti is what survivors remembered, what they chose to share, what Spanish chroniclers understood, and what happened to survive the centuries since. Yet through all these filters, the scale of his achievement remains visible. Modern archaeology has confirmed what the chronicles described and has revealed much that the chronicles missed. The roads still cross the mountains, their engineering still impressive even in ruins. The terraces still climb the hillsides, their drainage systems still functioning after 5 centuries. Machu Picchu, abandoned and forgotten until Hiram Bingham reached it in 1911, stands as testimony to what Inca builders accomplished. And Machu Picchu was a minor royal estate, a private retreat, not one of the empire's great monuments. The stonework still fits so precisely that knife blades cannot slip between the blocks. The astronomical alignments still mark the solstices. The Kulkar storehouses, empty now, still line the roads where they held reserves against famines that came and went centuries ago. What Pachacuti built was designed to endure, and much of it has. UNESCO has designated Cusco, Machu Picchu, and the Chapac Ñan as World Heritage Sites. International recognition that what Pachacuti created belongs not just to Peru, but to humanity. Tourists from around the world climb the terraces he ordered built, photograph the stones his workers fitted, wonder at the same engineering that awed Spanish conquistadors half a millennium ago. In Peru, he has become a national symbol. The forgotten prince who saved Cusco represents the indigenous heritage that Spanish colonialism tried to erase. His image appears on currency. His name marks streets and schools. The empire he built, destroyed though it was, demonstrates what Andean peoples accomplished before European contact. A civilization that rivaled any in the world, built without iron tools or wheeled vehicles or written language, organized through systems of reciprocity and administration that modern scholars still struggle to fully understand. He was born into a world that did not expect him to matter. He died having transformed that world beyond recognition. The kingdom he inherited barely extended beyond its valley. The empire he left his successors stretched from Colombia to Argentina. The city he defended as a young prince became a capital rebuilt in the shape of a puma, its temples gleaming with gold, its fortress walls rising above slopes that enemies could not climb. The systems he created, the roads, the storehouses, the administrators, the runners, held together a realm that should have been ungovernable, that controlled more territory than Rome had ever controlled, that endured until forces from another hemisphere brought catastrophes no one could have foreseen. He was Pachacuti, the Earthshaker, the transformer of the world. The mist still rises through the ruins of Machu Picchu at dawn, softening the stones that his workers placed 5.5 centuries ago. The terraces still climb the sacred valley, their walls still holding after earthquakes that toppled Spanish churches. The roads still trace paths across the mountains, visible from the air as lines drawn across landscapes where nothing should be possible. He built in stone because stone endured. He built with precision because precision reflected cosmic order. He built to last forever, knowing that forever was a human word for something only the mountains could achieve. The mountains remain, the roads remain, the terraces remain, and in the stones that still fit together after all these centuries, the memory of the man who placed them remains as well. Pachacuti is still here. He always will be.